As a team, we're going to crumble. Inch by inch, play by play, till we're finished. We're in hell right now, gentlemen. Believe me. And we can stay here, get the shit kicked out of us, or we can fight our way back into the light. We can climb out of hell. 1 inch at a time. You know, when you get old in life, things get taken from you. I mean, that's part of life. But you only learn that when you start losing stuff. You find out life's this game of inches. So is football. Because in either game, life or football, the margin for error is so small. I mean, 1/2 a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us. Hell yeah. They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second. On this team, we fight for that inch. On this team, we tear ourselves and everyone else around us to pieces for that inch. We claw our fingernails for that inch. Because we know when we add up all those inches, that's going to make the fucking difference between winning and losing. Between living and dying. I'll tell you this, in any fight, it's the guy who's willing to die who's going to win that inch. And I know if I'm going to have any life anymore, it's because I'm still willing to fight and die for that inch. Because that's what living is. There's 6 inches in front of your face. Now, I can't make you do it. You got to look at the guy next to you. Look into his eyes. Now, I think you're going to see a guy who will go that inch with you. You're going to see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're going to do the same for him. That's a team, gentlemen. And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
Ideas are bulletproof.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's show. It is January 18th, 2012. This is Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye, from FederalJack.com. Thank you for tuning in tonight. It's going to be a special broadcast that I have prepared for you guys. And as always, I try to bring you guys something special. And recently, I came across a 4-part interview, and I believe it was with Len Asenek. And I'll tell you about Len, and I'll tell you about who the interview is with in a second. But it's about, I would say, a little less than 8 hours long, just one of the interviews. And there's multiple ones with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. And you've heard me talk about him in his book, The Secret Team, on the show here before. So tonight, for a few segments, I'm going to bring Colonel Prouty on to the show. Now, he's been dead since 2001, so I'm not going to be doing a seance. I'm just going to be playing a small tidbit of this massive interview because I've tried to explain how he put into words, you know, how the CIA operates and everything else. And I can't do Colonel Prouty any justice. So I'm going to dedicate a few segments of my show tonight and give him the floor, and you guys will hear his voice from beyond the grave. Now, if it weren't for Len Asenek, none of us would be able to hear anything because he sat and interviewed Colonel Prouty back in the 80s and the 90s. And he's put different websites together. There's Black Op Radio, and then there's always Prouty.org, which is PROUTY.org. And it's pretty much the official Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty reference site. And for those of you that don't know who Colonel Prouty is, I'll read you a little blurb about who he, just a quick, a quick little, I don't know what you would call it, but a little blurb, I guess you could say, about him. But it's just about a small portion of his 23-year-long military career. He flew during World War II. He was a pilot. Colonel Prouty was a very interesting individual. And if you've ever seen the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, his character was, there was a character called Mr. X. That character was based on Prouty. So let me read you a little bit about who he is. Colonel Prouty spent 9 of his 23-year military career in the Pentagon from 1955 to 1964. 2 years with the Secretary of Defense, 2 years with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and 5 years with Headquarters, U.S. Air Force. In 1955, he was appointed the first focal point officer between the CIA and the Air Force for clandestine operations per National Security Council Directive 5412. He was briefing officer for the Secretary of Defense 1960 to 1961 and for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So as you can see, Colonel Prouty wasn't some Johnny-come-lately, wasn't some, moron, I guess you could say, somebody that could be easily debunked. Wasn't just some young guy, wasn't some old kooky professor, somebody that, they could try to marginalize. This guy was in their ranks. He was the first, what do they call it, focal point. I'm doing air quotes because it's got quotes on it. But he was the first chief, I guess you could say, of special operations under Kennedy. He was Mr. X's, the Mr. X character was him. The experience that he talked about was real when you see him talking to Garrison in the movie. All that happened. They sent him out of the country because at the time he would have been the one that would have been in charge. So they got him out of the way. Very interesting. I couldn't do him justice in a 4-hour radio show. So I urge you guys to check him out, Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. I've told you to read both his books, The Secret Team, JFK. Check out Prouty.org, Prouty.org. Give a big thanks to Mr. Lenasanik. And check out his show. I think he still does it. I haven't, I've been so busy I haven't gotten a chance to tune into Len in a very long time or even listen to any of his stuff that's up on the site. But I believe he still does. I think he might still do a live show once in a while, if not more often. Check it out, Black Op Radio. So we got a few minutes before the break comes up. So I'm going to wait until we get back into the second segment to play the clip. But I urge you guys again to go to Prouty.org, Prouty.org, and get his book, The Secret Team. It's imperative that you read this book to understand and for you to be able to explain how the CIA can control things. Because when you say to somebody, well, the CIA controls things, and they say, yeah, how? Explain it to me. And you're like, well, they own this, and they say, but give me an example. This way you can smash all of that. You can explain. Once you understand, you can break it down to a more simplistic form. As they say, can you break it down in one sentence? In fact, somebody actually commented, this is a 4-part video series, and there's way more interviews. If you go to Len's site or email him at osanic@prouty.org, which is osanic@prouty.org. Email him, and you can ask him about his show times or whatever, but he's got another site, and I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but you can purchase, it might even be at prouty.org, you might be able to get it there. the interviews that he's done and all the interviews that Colonel Prouty's done with a couple other people. I mean, this is historical, like, evidence that needs to be purchased and archived away somewhere. Because this stuff, if it disappears, it's gone. They'll never even talk about this. This is stuff that they won't talk about. And he talks about meetings where he exposes the truth about peak oil, so much stuff. Colonel Prouty was a very, very interesting individual. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break. We'll be right back. When we come back, you're going to hear from Colonel Prouty himself. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. I'm going to play the clip now for you. This is Len Osenek interviewing Colonel Prouty. And I am in the works of trying to get in contact with Len so I can get him on the show as a guest at least once, if not more. Because, I mean, he's got not only does he have his own radio show, so, he knows what's going on, and I want to get his take on that stuff, but I would love to, hear from his own, from him personally, because he got a chance to sit down and interview Colonel Prouty before he passed away in June of 2001, I may add. So it would have been interesting if Colonel Prouty had lived, what he would have said about 9/11. But Len got a chance to interview him, so it'll be an interesting perspective to hear from somebody who actually got a chance to meet Colonel Prouty in person. I certainly wish I could have met Colonel Prouty in person. So without further ado, let me start the interview here for you. I'm going to play a couple clips from it. Now you're going to hear him talk about what I queued up, and what I got to was they were talking about when they're talking about his book, The Secret Team. He explains about the National Security Council and the CIA and how they, the truth of things and how it works. I remember I've tried to explain this before on air, but I'd rather you hear it from Colonel Prouty himself. So here you go, ladies and gentlemen. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty.
All right, we're here with Fletcher Prouty, and it is now May 6th, 1989, beginning a series of questions regarding his book published in 1973 by Prentice Hall called The Secret Team. One of the most essential parts of post-World War II American political action and agendas seem to hinge on events that happened immediately after World War II. With the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, why don't you discuss the original intent of Congress of the role of the CIA as specified in this law?
It's very important in trying to discuss the National Security Act of 1947 to be sure that we go back into the spirit and the thinking of the time. We had just ended the greatest world war ever fought in late 1945 with the surrender of the Japanese on September 2nd, 1945. Early in 1946, President Truman abolished the OSS. There was no longer a need for an operating organization of that type now that the war was over. But there were assets of the OSS, primarily such things as agents lists, who the agents worked with, and other activities like that you just can't abandon. They have to be taken care of. And these were placed in an office which was concealed in the State Department for quite a while. And also, President Truman, by presidential directive, created the National Intelligence Group and placed it under General Vandenberg, Army officer, but later the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who had a considerable experience with intelligence matters. Both of these acts by President Truman were more or less standby. He knew that there would have to be some change in the law to act on these intelligence matters. At that time also, you'll remember that the Soviet Union had been our ally during the war, was not a stated enemy as it became very shortly after that. So that the National Security Act of 1947, written, the language of the law, written during 1946, was based pretty much on the reality of World War II and not upon the Cold War realities. Now, for those of us looking back, that's kind of hard to think about because we have so ingrained in us now the fact that the Soviet Union is the enemy, communism is the enemy, and that the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians, who were our enemy in World War II, are all now friends. So you must go back into that era and begin there when you talk about the origins of CIA and the passage of this very important law, the National Security Act of 1947. Because I was teaching a major course, a year-long course at Yale called The Evolution of Warfare, I was very interested, of necessity interested, in these activities of 1946 and 47 as part of my course. So I read everything I could get from the congressional hearings, from the newspapers, everything that was going in those years toward the creation of this law, this new law. What you could see was some rather practical things, and then you could see some indications of things that were going to come. First of all, the Army and Navy had to share their aviation interests with a new branch of the service, the Air Force. That was one of the things that the public recognized about this new law. We created then a single Department of Defense. We hadn't had one. And many of the many of the officers that had fought World War II did not like this term Department of Defense. There's a very basic distinction, especially in warfare, but in athletics, in sports, in competition, between being on the offense and being on the defense. On the offense, you know what you're doing. On the offense, you're planning something. If you're on the offense with a Department of War, as we used to have, it doesn't mean you're planning to fight, but it means you're ready to fight, and you let everybody know that. If you're on the Department of Defense, you're waiting for somebody else to make a move, and then you react. The philosophy of the entire military structure of this country changed with this business of the Department of Defense. And coming as it did right when we were the most powerful nation in the world, with an enormous Army, Navy, and Air Force, and the nuclear weapon, which nobody else had in that period, to put all of that on the defense was an enormous oversight. And those of us who were close to all that felt it that way. There was no way to say that the World War II armies of the United States were to go on the defense. That destroyed really the structure of the Army, and a lot of people on active service felt that at that time. I say that because this business of the communist, anti-communist bit, and the idea of a Department of War or Department of Navy as against Department of Defense, another major thing, was then joined by this new idea of a Central Intelligence Agency. Now, one of the problems during World War II was not that we did not have enough intelligence. It was that it wasn't coordinated. The intelligence that General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz had in the Pacific was not always coordinated with the intelligence that General Eisenhower and General Bradley and their allies had in the European theater. And a lot of times Washington had different intelligence from different sources and didn't have the means to coordinate it properly for the overall benefit of our military forces who are fighting all over the world. And we had new ways of gathering intelligence. We had new electronic means. Radar was used to gather intelligence. We had aerial photography. We had all kinds of devices that were not in the ordinary James Bond intelligence of pre-war days. So the Congress...
All right, I'm going to pause it right there. When we get back, I'm just going to pick it up coming out of the bumper. Right where I paused it. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. More with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty when we come back.
Understood from a lot of testimony from experienced military leaders that one of the greatest shortages and one of the greatest mistakes in the war was that we did not have coordinated intelligence. So when Congress wrote the language of this legislation for the CIA, and I printed this literally in the book so that anyone that wants to read it will see exactly what the law says. It said that the CIA is created to coordinate the intelligence of the rest of the government, and that was why it was created. With that as the primary duty of CIA, then the other little tasks and things that we're supposed to do come forward. And it's a better explanation. In fact, it is the only explanation when it is put that way. There was not a single word, for example, in the law that said that the CIA should collect intelligence. There wasn't a single word in the law that said the CIA should get involved in covert operations. And this is the same law that exists today, by the way. We haven't changed. But gradually things change, whether they're written into the law or not. But we're talking about the law of 1947, how it was written and what it meant. So that the people that first became members of this new CIA knew that their job was the coordination of intelligence. I have no doubt. The enormous move toward Cold War, anti-communism, and all that, all the buzzwords that we've lived on for the last 30 or 40 years, did not exist there, at least not strongly. It was coming over the horizon. While the National Security Act of 1947 was being written, primarily by men like the great lawyer Clark Clifford, close friend of President Truman's, and an enormously influential man in this period. While that was being done, Churchill had made his speech in Missouri about the Iron Curtain and the Cold War and those things. The country was beginning to move in that direction. The era, the strange McCarthy era, had not come, but it was inevitable. It was on the way. What to do with the nuclear weapons was underway at the time. For instance, our military had never had a weapon as dynamic as the atom bomb. And what is important about an atom bomb, as it is with a barrel of oil, is it has no real value until it's been delivered. Well, the organization most able to deliver the atom bomb was the Air Force. And immediately, war planners saw that to use atom bombs, we would have to have an enormous fleet of very large aircraft. And one of the first things they did was began to build a bigger and better B-29, which was the largest plane we had during the war. And finally, even the B-36 and then the B-52 to carry the atom bomb. They needed an enormous plane to do that. It was a monster of a device in those days. Well, these things began to shape strategy. Then as they began to think about this, if atom bombs were going to be used as the primary weapon, how were you going to put a Navy and an Army into the battleground that atom bombs had devastated or could devastate, either way? Because the enemy didn't have it. See, the enemy then, it used to be interesting. If you went to a military school in the 40s, you could talk about an enemy. But we were a Department of Defense. We weren't supposed to be talking about a particular enemy. And gradually, enemy became synonymous with Russia. And if we had opposing forces in a combat situation, we'd have the blue forces and the red forces. And we always knew we were the blue ones. And at the Soviet, gradually this thinking came about. So while we were predominant with the nuclear weapon, it almost was ridiculous to think of any country as equal opposite force to ours. And that furthermore underscored the enormous mistake made in calling this military the Department of Defense, because if ever we were strong on the offense, it was immediately after World War II. We weren't a defensive nation at that time, but we were made a defensive nation by the Department of Defense. I haven't heard many people discuss that in these so many words. I did in Yale when I was teaching. I used to talk about that a lot because I had hoped that was not really what was going to be the end of all this planning. Well, as the CIA started late in 47, it was primarily a rollover of World War II trained military people. the head of it was an admiral, Admiral Hillenkoetter. And I think out of the number that they had, over 5,000 were directly serving military people. They weren't reservists or anything. They were active duty people. And gradually, people from OSS and new recruitment began to fill up the agency. But that took years. That got into the Allen Dulles era in the Eisenhower administration. During the late 40s, the number of civilians that rolled into the agency gradually was a relatively small number. I say relatively small with respect to, say, today. And among them, though, were some very strong OSS residual members who were well-trained in the side of covert work that involves clandestine operations. And despite the fact that that was totally overlooked in the law, even so much as to suppress that kind of activity by not putting it in the law and not creating a budget basis for that kind of expenditure of funds, the people with that training came into the CIA. Certainly the military wasn't going to get into that business, nor was the State Department. So it was a question of where do you keep this? So the residual OSS capability fell into the lap of the CIA. But even then, that took years. That didn't happen until General Walter Beetle Smith came home from Russia, where he had been ambassador to Russia, and became the director of Central Intelligence in, I believe, about 1950.
October of 1950.
And at that time, he brought Allen Dulles in as his deputy director of plans, which means in charge of covert operations. Well, Dulles had been with the OSS. And then he announced to the president that if he was going to be in charge, if he was going to be the director of Central Intelligence, he was going to have OPC under him and not scattered around with responsibilities in the State Department and the Defense Department. A lot has been said about OPC in the sense that how could such an organization have been created without law, and how was this ingenious little device of appointing its senior officer? The way it read was that he would be nominated by one secretary, either State or Defense, and having to be seconded by the other, and then would be approved, and as though he didn't have a single commander. Well, everybody knew that was temporary, and it had no real significance because the real things that OPC was doing was to preserve certain assets, certain highly classified assets of World War II. He was not initiating operations. Now, I don't mean to say that disregarding some of the very practical things that were being done. For instance, we had clandestine operations underway in Greece as a result of the Greek Civil War right after the World War II, and these spilled over into Bulgaria and nearby countries across the Greek border. We had other operations going on in China, but relatively speaking, they were small, and they were, again, residuals of World War II. They were not planned operations as against some communist nation or that kind of thing. They were there, but they existed, and this was there. And the chief of OPC at the time was Frank Wisner, who had been a very dominant OSS leader in Eastern Europe during World War II, and later who led this massive campaign against Indonesia in 1958. So Wisner was very active in the covert activities. But when General Smith became the DCI, he insisted upon bringing that group into the agency. Now, strictly speaking, that was not supported by law. It was sort of an expedient. One of the most important facets of this National Security Act of 1947 was the creation of the National Security Council. We had not had something like that in peacetime in other years, not under Roosevelt, not before, and I don't even recall anything like that in World War I period.
All right, I'm going to cut Colonel Prouty off right there, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to go to our next break. When we come back, I will do the same thing. I'll pick it up right at the end of the bumper, right where he left off, because the information he's getting out is just too important. I'll probably play maybe one or two more clips in the second hour. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
What was decided was that there are times when, for purposes of national security, there must be top-level decisions, and that the president needed assistance in making those decisions. So the National Security Council, by law, is the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, and the secretary of defense. No others. They can invite others, and others do attend the meetings, but there are no other statutory members. If we relate that to today's affairs, in all these questions about the Iran and Contra hearings and all those problems, there could not have been a decision about covert operations involving the Contras or Iran or exchange of hostages or any of that without a decision from the National Security Council. That's by law. There's no other way to do it other than an illegal way, and I don't think that's ever even been assumed, that there had to be decisions from the National Security Council. From my own experience and background, I just cannot believe that the members of the National Security Council during this Iran-Contra period have removed themselves from the whole thing as though they had nothing to do with it. That's preposterous. By law, they had to. If they didn't do it, they were derelict in their duty, and they should be tried for that. That's what the National Security Council was created to do. And in the 40s, the National Security Council met and created a directive which I believe was called 10-2. And 10-2 recognized that the U.S. government might from time to time be involved or involve itself in covert action. Generally, this would mean relatively small activities, not major warfare like the Korean War or the Vietnam War, that kind of thing, not even like the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. I believe these were truly clandestine covert actions, and there were many of them. Later on, when I got into this business in the 50s, we had things like that going all the time, but they were small. Now, the decision to involve the United States in covert action had to be made by this National Security Council. No one else had the authority. And you see, that means even that the DCI, the head of the intelligence agency, was not part of the National Security Council. Therefore, he was not involved in the decision. He would be told about the decision. Well, during the 40s and the early 50s, things worked that way. In 1948, a rather important thing happened. President Truman wanted to have a highly qualified group study how the CIA was moving along, how it was progressing, and whether or not it was becoming effective. So he established a committee headed by Allen Dulles, who was a New York lawyer with the most prominent and largest law firm in New York City, Sullivan Cromwell. A man named Matthias Correa, who I believe also was a lawyer, although I don't recall his career that closely. His name, Correa, C-O-R-R-E-A, Matthias Correa. And then a man named Jackson. Jackson had a lot of experience, OSS experience. I think Correa did, and I certainly know that Dulles did. But anyway, this committee of three men, primarily Allen Dulles, made an extensive study of the activities of the CIA, and in their report to the president, recommended a move more into the clandestine operations area and more into the traditional intelligence area than the law had even visualized. Well, a very interesting thing about this committee, it was appointed by President Truman in his final year as president, as a successor to Roosevelt. See, Roosevelt died in 45, and he was the vice president, so he hadn't won an election yet, and he was going to run for re-election late 48 and then a new term beginning in 49. His opponent was Thomas E. Dewey. And interestingly, Thomas Dewey's speechwriter during the 1948 campaign against Truman was Allen Dulles. So you see, Dulles was riding two horses across this stream. He was technically Truman's advisor with respect to intelligence matters, he and Jackson and Correa. At the same time, he's writing speeches for Thomas E. Dewey, strongly opposing the re-election of Truman. I don't know whether Truman knew he was writing speeches for Dewey or whether Dewey knew he was working for Truman. I mean, I have no way to solve that little problem. But it's pretty neat to understand the effect of that, and it helps you understand the mind of this man Dulles. Dulles see nothing wrong in that sort of thing, you see nothing wrong in working for Truman and trying to undercut him by helping Dewey or vice versa. Well, this had an influence on the report because, of course, Dulles, as was Jackson and Correa, were absolutely convinced, along with most of the country, that Dewey was going to be elected president. So as he wrote this report, he saw that report as, you might say, his own Mein Kampf. It was his own idea of what CIA was going to become because he was positive that Dewey would make him the Director of Central Intelligence when Dewey became president. See, and that designed the report. Well, as we know, Truman turned around and beat Dewey in a great surprise. And without much ado, the Dulles, Jackson, and Correa report was slid under the White House door on the 1st of January, 1949, and we never heard much of it after that. Although many of the things within the report did appear years later, because when Eisenhower became president, John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State, General Walter Beadle Smith became his deputy in the Secretary of State, stepped down from CIA, and Allen Dulles became the Director of Central Intelligence. Well, at that time, Dulles pulled out his own Dulles-Jackson-Correa report and began to put it in effect, and as you know, he remained the DCI for the next 11 years. Really, the signal primary character of the CIA is Mr. Dulles. There's no question about it. It's his agency, and nobody else has left any mark like his. But you need to see that background to understand what the passage of the National Security Act really meant in 1947, and what it says in law is what creates many of these controversies about intelligence today, because there still is no law that says that the CIA is an intelligence organization. It says it's a coordinating agent, and there's no law that says it is a covert operation agency. So that's a fairly good summary, as I've seen it through my own lifetime, of the law itself, the effect of the law, and then particularly how the CIA was an outgrowth of the law, and what the CIA was trying to do, and what the National Security Council was trying to do, and what the Congress was trying to do. And this eventually led to a remarkable statement by President Truman, I believe in December 1963, when he wrote as a columnist for a newspaper that the greatest mistake he made in his entire career as president was to sign the bill that created the Central Intelligence Agency.
Even though at the time it could be argued that he would not have seen the effect of his signing into law something which over time was changed by degree into something else.
Well, it's true that he never did sign the law. The law he signed, if they had stayed within its parameters, the agency would have been much different. But he recognized that by setting this up, he initiated it.
I guess this perhaps is already explained by what you've just said, but perhaps just to comment briefly on this, you wrote on page 138 of The Secret Team that Congress had been so certain that the agency would not become operational and policy making that it was content to place it under the control of a committee. Congress knew that the agency would never be permitted to become involved in clandestine operations, and therefore that the NSC would never have to direct it in an operational sense. How, at the time, do you feel Congress felt so unequivocal about this?
Well, you see, that's not a hard statement to understand in the time of the 1940s. It is today in the 80s or in the 70s or in the 60s. In the late 1940s, Congress and the congressmen who were, many of them, veterans of World War II, knew very well that the United States government was not going to have a covert operation, covert establishment running around the world, and they had not even created a new major intelligence organization. Congress, in other words, believed the words of the law that it had just written and passed. Furthermore, we weren't in the buzzword period or the Pavlovian period of anti-communism at that time. It was coming, but it didn't exist then. Yeah. And we were sitting on top of the atom bomb capability, which meant that we were the absolute power in the world. Things were so different in the late 40s that you can't take those statements without a lot of care and understanding and transpose them to either the 60s, the 70s, or 80s. It's just ridiculous. You have to read them in terms of the 40s. And that's a pretty true statement of the 40s. Mm-hmm. But, of course, you'd change it if you were writing it today. And I'm sure Congress' view of CIA today is nothing like that, you see. But that is an important commentary on what has changed. And what has changed really in the people's minds, but not really.
This is Sparta!
I'm going to cut it off right there, ladies and gentlemen. Stay tuned for hour number 2. Colonel Prouty is a little more than halfway through with the info I wanted him to get out, so there will be a little more when we come back. Interesting stuff. History is definitely... Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on this live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. It is January 18th, 2012. I'm your host, Popeye, from federaljack.com. And tonight, I'm playing you some clips from one of Len Asenek's many interviews with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. And right now, he's discussing his book, The Secret Team, and it's an 8-hour interview. You can go to my YouTube channel, and you can see it's in 4 parts. It's like, it's a little under 8 hours. I forget the exact total time, but it's around there. It's in 4 parts. Go to Federal Jack Tube 6, Federal Jack Tube, and then number 6, all one word on YouTube, and you'll see it. It's listed under The Secret Team. I suggest you take the time to listen to the entire thing in its entirety. But because I constantly bring up Colonel Prouty and I constantly make reference to his book, The Secret Team, and I'm always talking about this stuff, and I piece it together here and there for you, rather than listen to me piece it together and, you have to try to take what I say and go, and then, it's me. It's like the telephone game. I'd rather you hear it right from the horse's mouth. So I'm going to give Colonel Prouty as much time as it's going to take for the rest of this portion of this last piece of the clip that I want to play here for you guys. So it'll probably be another segment or 2. But I'm going to get right back into it so you guys can hear. So again, Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. And check out prouty.org, PROUTY.org. And again, a big thanks to Len Asenek. And by the way, I want to give a big shout out to YouTube user Conspiracy Scope. Thanks, buddy, for uploading all the May Brussels, old May Brussels broadcasts, and letting me rip them and re-upload them to my channel. For you guys that don't know, ladies and gentlemen, go check out my channel. I have, or you can check out Conspiracy Scope on YouTube too, and he's got all the May Brussels uploads as well as I got the same ones, and it's just some great radio back from the 70s into the 80s, and she was a conspiracy broadcaster. Really, really good stuff. Some of her stuff was done on tapes because she had gotten death threats because of the stuff she covered, so it's really a glimpse into history and the things that she talks about, and you listen, you know what happened today. It's like I said, when you read None Dare Call Conspiracy, it's the same thing. It's like, wow, that book was written like 40 some odd years ago, if not longer. It's incredible. All right, here we go. More Colonel Prouty.
In the language of the law, same law exists, but it's people's minds that have changed. It's our concept of the world that has changed, and that's a very important statement.
Mm-hmm. You do describe in fairly multitude of examples Alan Dulles' ability to, in effect, subvert the watchdog role of the NSC, which was intended to prevent such things as the CIA carrying out clandestine operations, by such moves as engineering the creation of such subcommittees as the Special Group 5412/2 that effectively neutralized such oversight functions as were intended to be carried out under the authority of the Operations Coordinating Board. Now, you've just mentioned how the OCB originally was set up to, in effect, have some supposed authority given to it by the Secretaries of Defense and State, and then how Walter Beadle Smith in late 1950, in a sense, regained that person's position as claiming it for himself, that person was directly under him. Can you explain somehow, particularly Dulles, who is so central to this, was able to redefine this watchdog role of the NSC over clandestine operations?
Okay, first of all, let me make a technical correction to your question. The OCB was the Operations Coordinating Board, which was a part of NSC by law. OCB was intended to be a group of senior individuals, or it was a group of senior individuals who would follow the decisions made by the National Security Council and make sure that the bureaucracy carried them out. That was the function of the OCB, a different organization. The Operations Policy, OPC, the Operations Policy Committee,
right,
was the residual OSS organization that was under Frank Wisner, and an extremely distinct organization from OCB.
Okay.
The OPC had been created only without law. See, it came from World War II. It was a necessary function. It was like sweeping up things left on the floor after the war. We had to keep alive the records from the OSS, and it was agreed to put this organization only structurally within the State Department, but to control its chief by making the new Secretary of Defense and his counterpart, Secretary of State, responsible for the leader of the organization, giving him some control that way. The budgetary function was minimal. It was just a matter of paying people, that's about all, and taking care of the records. A lot of people have misinterpreted the OPC, although when it gradually worked its way into the CIA under Beadle Smith, it did become dominant. Again, it became rather strong, and it became the main clandestine operations sector of the agency, later known as the Deputy Director of Plans, and that sort of thing. So I like to correct the two. The two letters are somewhat similar, but the jobs are entirely different. Now we'll go back to Mr. Dulles and how he was able to circumvent the law. And really, the best way is to say again that the report that he had written with Correa and with Jackson outlined his vision of how the CIA ought to be. He believed that. He thought that it ought to have a full intelligence powers, including secret intelligence, and that it ought to have the clandestine capability to carry out any operations directed by the National Security Council. Well, by the time, see, he thought that could be started in '49. But by the time he got to be the DCI, things hadn't worked that way. The CIA had been kept rather quiet. It was coordinating intelligence, and it was doing very little in the covert activities field. He felt that should change, but he didn't have any law to do it. So what he did is he would take a plan that they had made up because of some input from a foreign country or from one of his station chiefs around the world that was in response to some action. Well, then he'd go to the National Security Council. They didn't direct him to go to X country and do something. They were approving something that he felt he ought to do in response to an action that some of his operators, some of his agents had seen in a foreign country. And that device enabled him to create activities as though they were reaction, and most of the time they were, or responses. And so the NSC found itself not directing covert operations, but approving reactive covert operations. There's quite a bit of difference. But when you're doing that with an organization like the CIA, under an ambitious leader like Allen Dulles, it's pretty hard to tell the difference, because sometimes you can create a response by kicking somebody under the table and they pound you in the nose, then you point to your partner and say, look at that guy just hit me. You didn't know you kicked him under the table. The best example, the absolute best example I know of that tactic was the Gulf of...
I have to interrupt him for a second. He's about to say the Gulf of Tonkin, but he's talking about false flag operations, ladies and gentlemen.
Tonkin incident. The Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese that came out in the vicinity of the destroyers, which the Navy now admits were never even hit by anything fired at them, probably not even fired at. But why those North Vietnamese Comar ships, very high-speed ships, came out there was because they had been hit clandestinely. So that the first act was by our own forces, aided with South Vietnamese. Then when the North Vietnamese came out, they had been provoked. It wasn't, they did not initiate the attack. But
there you go, ladies and gentlemen.
It's all the same.
More from Colonel Prouty when we get back.
In the discussion of that, both by President Johnson and in Congress, when they were discussing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, they were only told that the attack had been made by the North Vietnamese upon our Navy without provocation. So you can control covert activities by using that same device, the kick under the table, and then you can say, hey, now look what happened in the Congo, or look what happened in Indonesia, or look what happened in Tibet. We've got to do something about it. This was the technique that Dulles was the master of working at, and he tried to have the agency ready to be responsive anywhere in the world. And, of course, he had to do it that way because there were no plans. They didn't sit here and say, well, here's what we see happening in such and such a country, and here's what we think ought to be done, and here's how the United States should get in there with a covert operation to perform this or that. You know, there was none of that. There was no planning shop. In fact, I've always thought, and I work very closely with them, that one of the strangest devices they used was to call their covert operations the deputy director plans, because there were no plans. I worked with them intimately for 9 years. I never saw a single plan come out of the deputy director plans. And of course they would simply smile and say, well, that's just our euphemism for covert operations. But it was, they could have used some other word than plan, because that was, but this is how Dulles worked, you see, and he was very effective. And he had had a lot of experience with OSS. And the other side of it is that his brother was the Secretary of State and the dominant vote in the National Security Council. I don't think this would have been the same if he had been an individual with, say, some either neutral or objective Secretary of State. It made quite a bit of difference under the Eisenhower era to have the two Dulles working together in the development of covert operations.
And therefore, then, this key revising of the word as specified in the law that the NSC would direct the CIA, and now that the agency was in effect to turn this into the NSC approving measures brought to it by the CIA.
Precisely. See, I remember one example out of 9 years' work when I knew that the NSC had directed the CIA to involve itself in something, and that was Tibet. When the Chinese communists started overrunning Tibet, it was the NSC that put the CIA into that operation. And I must confess that in all those years, 55 to 64, pretty active years, I never saw another one come by direction. They were all responsive and reactive operations to things where Mr. Dulles or people that followed him would go in to brief the NSC from their own papers and say, here's what's been happening in country A. We propose an operation to oppose that. That's why we got into what was called counterinsurgency. We countered the insurgency. Yeah. Almost everything we were doing was a reactive response. But that was the Dulles method. That was his characteristic.
I'd like to quote a part here regarding the intelligence community as a whole. You wrote that on page 141 of the Secret Team, over the years it has become customary to speak of the various intelligence organizations within the government as members of the community. This word is quite proper because there is little cohesion and homogeneity within this vast infrastructure which has cost so much and which performs so many varied and separate functions. The members of the community are the CIA, the Army, Navy, and Air Force as separate divisions, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the Atomic Energy Commission, the State Department, and the National Security Agency. All are by law brought together by the Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI. His title is not the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, although he does head that agency for the purpose of advising the NSC in matters concerning such intelligence activities of the government departments and agencies as relate to national security. That's directly from the National Security Act of 1947. This is the DCI's first duty as prescribed by law. He is to advise the NSC of the activities of the other departments and agencies. Could you discuss the importance of the fact that all of the above listed members of the intelligence community, quote, are by law brought together by the Director of Central Intelligence, unquote, and the implications of such an all-encompassing position?
That's a good section to bring out for discussion, because the law didn't establish means something else in government. The law created the CIA to coordinate intelligence of the other branch of the government, as I listed them there. And the law specifically deals with the function of the Director of Central Intelligence. He is different from his organization. He is the Director of Intelligence over the other intelligence organizations within the scope of the law that establish him. He's not their boss in a sense that the Navy intelligence operates for the CNO, for the Chief of the Navy. But as far as intelligence matters are concerned, and as far as coordinating intelligence matters, he's the director for the coordinating purposes. It's quite a clear distinction, but you can see it does get waffled around. And certain of the intelligence assets of various departments, we'll say the Navy, are very independent. Navy's intelligence organization goes way back to Revolutionary War days. They are an excellent professional organization, and they're worldwide, and they're very powerful and very able. They were not subverting themselves to any new boss. They knew their job, and they made that clear when the law was being written. In fact, they protested the law more than anybody else. The Army has its own black intelligence, very deep intelligence, in many ways deeper than the CIA has ever learned how to do. They were not going to fold that into the CIA either. The Air Force was brand new, had no intelligence other than experience as part of the Army. However, the Air Force had the aircraft, the U-2, the SR-71, the bombers and the camera plane, all the reconnaissance planes. They had the methods of intelligence that they could use that the DCI needed for coordinating also. So the Air Force, although it was new, in some ways was probably more important than the other branches. So you see, what I'm saying is that this intelligence community, which the law was created to bring together, was not homogeneous, but they were essential to each other. No more than, say, the National Security Agency. Just think what any of these would be without the National Security Agency. They all depend upon the National Security Agency for the intercept of electronic transmission and all the other things, communications intelligence and all the rest. Well, the National Security Agency is a function of the Department of Defense. In fact, the office where I used to be assigned was responsible for directing the National Security Agency in order that we could coordinate it with state and CIA and the others ourselves to make sure it was effective. A very nice way to do this thing, and it was important in those days. So there is an intelligence community of great importance and great significance to each one of its components. But the sole chief of that community by law is the Director of Central Intelligence in the role that he's coordinating. No more than that. He doesn't direct these people in a clandestine exercise, not at all. Then he's the Director of then he is the head of the CIA, and then he carries out things that are assigned to the CIA. So, I'm sorry, it's quite clear how that works, although I'm afraid historically there are many, many abuses and a lot of times oversights in that, primarily because many of these agencies and departments have very parochial interests of their own.
We're going to break, ladies and gentlemen. We're back in a few minutes. I hope you learned a lot from Colonel Prouty tonight. Just an amazing, amazing man. We'll be right back. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all the listeners for hanging out and listening for about the past hour to Colonel Prouty. I hope you guys sat and actually paid attention, because I'm sure you learned a little bit different version of history than what you were either taught, or maybe you didn't even know at all. Now you understand the CIA and the intelligence agencies a little bit better than I could have explained it. You know, he had an insider's point of view, and he was very eloquent, that's the proper word, with how he came across. So why listen to me, you know, ramble and rant and, you know, undoubtedly, because it happens, end up putting your own slant on things, because that's the way it works when someone brings out information, you know, when they're talking about it kind of out of the, you know, as a researcher, as opposed to somebody who's experienced it. He has a insider's point of view. So for your benefit, I would rather you guys hear it right from the horse's mouth. That's why I played it. But that is not in any way, anywhere even close to even like a quarter of this one interview by itself. And there's multiple interviews. If you go to Len's site, you can purchase the there's links there, and it'll take you where you can purchase some of Prouty's work. And I think Len's got like bundle stuff where you can get a bunch of his stuff. And as I said, I'm in the process of you know, scheduling and everything to get him on soon. He got the chance to interview Colonel Prouty, so it's just too bad Colonel Prouty didn't last longer, because I really would have liked to have heard his thoughts on 9/11, both right after it happened and if he was still alive, you know, thoughts on what's going on now. Because, again, insider's point of view, rare point of view that you never get. Get Colonel Prouty's, both his books. You can probably get them on Amazon. Or, you know, if you go to prouty.org, you could probably get them there, too. I'm sure there's links. PROUTY.org. And no, I'm not getting paid for any of this. Like I said, I do this because I get a couple hours a week to spend with you guys, at least 6. And I like to bring real good information to the table. And, you know, Colonel Prouty is way better at describing it than me. Now, I want to get into something here. You heard him talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, right? You heard him, okay? Not some conspiracy theory. You heard Colonel Prouty talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, how they knew it was fake. Now, let's flash forward to, what was it, 2008? The end of 2007, beginning of 2008, somewhere around there. Dick Cheney says we should, you know, comes out, Cy Hirsch from the New Yorker comes out and releases this article, and Cheney wanted to dress up special operators like Iranian Navy, put them on boats that were made up to look like Iranian patrol boats, the little small boats. And they were going to strafe Coast Guard vessels and naval vessels in the Straits of Hormuz, kill sailors, okay, and then blame it on the Iranian Navy as an excuse to attack them. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound just like the dullest doctrine that Colonel Prouty was describing? How they would create the problem and then react to the reaction of the problem that they created? So they would create the problem, and then the other side would actually, in all reality, be reacting. And then they would come in and, quote-unquote, react to the other side's reaction and attack and claim it as justified. So this is a very old playbook. So for those of you that don't believe that 9/11 was an inside job, or, oh, you conspiracy theorists, and I'm doing air quotes, you guys are all crazy. Well, how are you going to tell this guy he's crazy? I mean, you can't, he's dead, but what are you going to say? Oh, he was getting crazy in his older years? He talked about this stuff for a long time. He wasn't crazy at all. Again, JFK, and the other book is The Secret Team. And support Len, because he did all, he pays for all this out of his own pocket and everything to have this archive up free for everybody to go check out. So if there's any way, I don't know if there's a link on there to even support him, but maybe if when you purchase the older archives, maybe that'll help him, fund the archive and to have this stuff up on the internet as long as we still have a free internet. So give Len a hand if you guys can. As always, it's good to support the alternative media, and I don't like to just promote myself. I don't, in fact, I rarely ever shamelessly promote myself, but I try to promote, I promote Orion. It's, if you can help Orion out, help all the alternative media out if you can, you know what I mean? But the biggest help you guys can be is to email our articles to your friends, to your loved ones, your coworkers, articles, videos, because we put a lot of effort into doing this and presenting it to everybody. So if you guys can pass it around, pass out links to the radio sites, like Orion, pass out links to Federal Jack, the Intel Hub, anything, any alternative outlet you guys can think of, Bob Tuskin's radio show and his website, pass out links for, we're all in this together. So there's plenty of room on this massive boat for all of us. So we don't need to, we all need to work together. That way we can defeat this monster, evolve together, and hopefully maybe eventually start to explore like outer space and the oceans and everything else. Anyway, I'm digressing here. It's important to note what Colonel Prouty said about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, because now you have, what was it? I think it was almost like a week and a half ago now that the Coast Guard cutter Adak and a naval vessel were both screwed with by quote-unquote Iranian small boats. And they weren't shot at or anything, but they were harassed, is what you would call it. And it's very interesting how this happened to go down the same way Cheney happened to, come up with this idea. And by the way, for those of you that don't think Cheney is still involved, you can ask Joe Joseph about that. He'll tell you. Cheney, he found evidence. I think it was Mrs. Joe Joseph that found the evidence. She's ever the avid researcher. And I think it was her that found the evidence that Cheney was in on the NDAA sessions, like closed door behind the scenes. Why is Dick Cheney talking to the Congress and the Senate and whoever else he was chatting with, closed door behind the scenes, about SOPA? Why is he talking to congressmen and senators about this stuff? Why is he still involved? He's nothing. Why is he there? What are they going to say? He's an advisor? He's a war criminal. He shouldn't be allowed in there. First of all, he should be under arrest. Somebody should just unplug his battery and call it a day. Put him in a chair, unplug his battery, and just let him sit there and just watch him go. Televise it, charge $5 a head, and give the money. Start giving the billions of dollars you'll make because people worldwide will watch it. Give that to the Iraqi people, and maybe, just maybe, that'll be a start. And that won't cover it, but it'll be a start on making up for what we allowed to happen. And let's not let it happen again with Iran. And getting back into this whole boat thing, look at what happened. Look at how it went down. Kind of like what Cheney had talked about, right? Now, flashback to what Colonel Prouty had said. The reason it's very important to look at history is because it repeats itself. And I'm pretty sure if Colonel Prouty were alive today, and he was on my show right now, he would say, Popeye, these things, 9/11, this, and I don't know for sure, this could have been the Iranians, but possibly, I'll say this, kind of fit the same playbook. And remember, Cheney had talked about it. I'm pretty sure he would say that, 9/11, the Oklahoma City. He was a smart man. I'm sure he would say that they were all used just like the Gulf of Tonkin. Unfortunately, Colonel Prouty's no longer with us, so we'll never know. We can speculate till the cows come home. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned for the final segment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with the final segment of tonight's episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. I want to remind everybody that I have a little side project going on called Veterans Views. Any active duty veterans, any veterans of any war. It could be Vietnam, World War II, whatever conflict. Combat, non-combat, does not matter. Everybody is equal in respect in my eyes. And email me at info@federaljack.com. info@federaljack.com. Spout off. Sound off like you got a pair. Get angry. If there's something, and you don't have to use your real name or whatever. I don't expect you to. Use some sort of clever, quote unquote radio name if you want. And, tell me how you feel about being used as a pawn, and, let me know if you know about the New World Order. Obviously, if you're listening to my show, you probably do. If there's something you need to get out, if there's a story, something dealing with the VA medical system, something fishy or shady that you want to get out and, blow the whistle on, contact me. If you just want to rant, contact me. Whatever. That's what the segment I'm going to, use the emails to do is I want to give you guys a voice, you ladies and gentlemen. Excuse me, let me correct myself. Gentlemen and ladies. So, men and women, not just the guys. If there's female veterans that listen to my show, email me. Again, info@federaljack.com. Whatever, if you guys had an experience, a bad experience, and you need to get it out, and you want to get it public, you want to be interviewed, whatever, I'm willing to give you as much time as possible. Again, I know that you don't really get a chance to have a voice that often, so anybody that's a war resistor and you want to use an anonymous name and call in and you have to do stuff cloak and daggerish, that's fine too. Anybody that needs to get their message out, I'm willing to help you, and that's what Veterans Views is for. So, email me again, info@federaljack.com. Anything you guys have to say. One more time, make sure you go check out Len Osenek's site on Colonel Prouty, prouty.org, Prouty.org. And there's links to, all other stuff, other sites that Len has up. And again, support him in any way, shape you can, because this information is important. And make sure you buy Colonel Prouty's 2 books, because it's, like I always say, it's important to have stuff in physical print, because you never know. It could go, they could run out and they could stop making it, and then you never know what could happen. So it's always better to have a copy on hand. Books are one of the best gifts you could ever give somebody. When I was a kid, I even appreciated books. And not as much as I do now, but it's amazing. They could survive, hundreds of years, given the, put in the right spot and taken care of the right way. An EMP blast could hit, the electrical grid could go down, and you'd still have your book. You could sit there with a candle and read it. You'd still be able to get that knowledge. So it might be, quote unquote, old-fashioned technology, but there's no reason to get rid of it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know what I'm saying? Ladies and gentlemen, you need to research the topics that I talk about and that these other hosts talk about. You need to educate yourself more. You need to read when I tell you about a book. Make sure you read it. Make sure you educate yourself, so you can understand the things that are going on now with through a different set of eyes, I guess you could say. Like, once you understand, especially listening to, that's why I played again the clip I played of Colonel Prouty tonight, and I wanted you to hear specifically at the end there when he talked about the Gulf of Tonkin and how they knew, and this is, I forget when it was, I think it was, I think he said it was in the late 80s if I remember, but I could be wrong. Anyway, that they knew at that point, or Colonel Prouty knew at that point when he was being interviewed, and even back then earlier when, they knew it, that it was fake. It was BS. It didn't happen. They knew it was a setup, and they knew, if you go research the Gulf of Tonkin now, you'll realize the night that they say that it happened, that nothing happened at all, and the only exchange of fire was the previous night, and that was when the patrol, the North Vietnamese, had taken fire from us again, like Colonel Prouty said, an instigated act. Now, it's important that you hear this and see this stuff. It's important that I come at you from every angle with this and say, look, here it is from this guy. Here it is from this person. Here it is, because it's all evidence. Eventually, either you're going to look at it and go, wow, you're going to be convinced. You're going to research it yourself. That's the whole point of this, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not some guy to look up to. I'm not some big ego. I'm not anything special. I'm just consider me like a teacher, I guess. And I'm just bringing you this information, and I expect you to run with it and do homework. Somebody made a joke the other day in my chat room. They said Popeye gives homework, and I do, because I want you to go educate yourselves. I can lead you to the water, but I cannot make you drink. I can't force you to accept this knowledge. I can't force it into your head. And that's why I don't come out and yell at you. I don't try to push it on you. I try to present it in a way that everybody can appeal to. Not just a certain group of individuals or somebody that's scared or anything like that. I want everybody to just be relaxed and try to take the knowledge in and run with it. I don't expect you to believe anything that I tell you just because I say it. I urge you to go research it. Again, this is not about me whatsoever. It's about the message that I bring forth and the info I bring forward. And that's why I always give you guys references and stuff so you can educate yourself. I don't ever want you to say, well, I believe it because Popeye from federaljack.com said it. No. Don't ever, ever, ever do that. Or anybody. Don't be like that with anybody out there that brings forth any information. Research it for yourself. Always research. If somebody brings you information and doesn't offer you the references to go see where they learned that from, and they can't show you where, they were able to look and sit and, go over it and come up with, their theory of things or their belief, then you shouldn't believe them. It's as simple as that. It's like I tell people when they go to get tattooed, look at the artist's portfolio. If his portfolio sucks, then don't get tattooed. Well, same thing. Okay? If someone comes forward with just some info, but they can't back it up with any resources or any place to, anything to back it up, be wary of it. It could be disinfo. It could be just somebody's just, misinformed. That happens a lot too. And people are like, oh, I think the guy's a shill. Half the time, it's people just don't know their ass from their elbow. And they're talking because they do exactly what I said not to. And that's they believe 100% what they hear because someone, a certain host, whoever that may be, whatever their favorite host is, happens to say something or talk about it on his radio show. And that's not why I do radio at all. I do this because I want to share my knowledge. I have all this information in my head and I need to get it out. Bill Cooper said in one of his talks that it is such a burden to have this information and all this knowledge and try to get it across to people, because the general public is mostly, asleep. And at the time, it was much harder. But now we have the opportunity and the tools to level the playing field. And we're doing just that, and that's why they want SOPA and PIPA and all this other crap, and they want to create the police state and the camps and everything else. And you hear, what's his name? Rockefeller. J. Rockefeller. Perhaps the internet should never have been invented. Perhaps you should never have been invented. You know what I'm saying? Your father either should have pulled out or something else, because you shouldn't have been invented, you evil prick. He doesn't want the internet, ladies and gentlemen, because he's afraid, because it levels the playing field. And yes, I had to get rude and crude for a minute, because he's a vile scumbag. If you understood the depths of evil that man is. Ugh. It's another show in itself. Well, unfortunately, I'm out of time this evening. Thank you for joining me. As always, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to sit here with you for 2 hours, 3 nights a week. Make sure you educate yourselves. Carry on. Semper Fi, I'm out. Focal point officer between the CIA and the Air Force for clandestine operations per National Security Council Directive 5412. He was briefing officer for the Secretary of Defense 1960 to 1961 and for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So as you can see, Colonel Prouty wasn't some Johnny-come-lately, wasn't some, moron, I guess you could say, somebody that could be easily debunked. Wasn't just some young guy, wasn't some old kooky professor, somebody that, they could try to marginalize. This guy was in their ranks. He was the first, what do they call it, focal point. I'm doing air quotes because it's got quotes on it. But he was the first chief, I guess you could say, of special operations under Kennedy. He was Mr. X's, the Mr. X character was him. The experience that he talked about was real when you see him talking to Garrison in the movie. All that happened. They sent him out of the country because at the time he would have been the one that would have been in charge. So they got him out of the way. Very interesting. I couldn't do him justice in a 4-hour radio show. So I urge you guys to check him out, Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. I've told you to read both his books, The Secret Team, JFK. Check out Prouty.org, Prouty.org. Give a big thanks to Mr. Lenasanik. And check out his show. I think he still does it. I haven't, I've been so busy I haven't gotten a chance to tune into Len in a very long time or even listen to any of his. I'm just going to be playing a small tidbit of this massive interview because I've tried to explain how he put into words, how the CIA operates and everything else. And I can't do Colonel Prouty any justice. So I'm going to dedicate a few segments of my show tonight and give him the floor, and you guys will hear his voice from beyond the grave. Now, if it weren't for Lenasanik, none of us would be able to hear anything because he sat and interviewed Colonel Prouty back in the 80s and the 90s. And he's put different websites together. There's Black Op Radio, and then there's always Prouty.org, which is Prouty.org. And it's pretty much the official Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty reference site. And for those of you that don't know who Colonel Prouty is, I'll read you a little blurb about who he, just a quick, a quick little, I don't know what you would call it, but a little blurb, I guess you could say, about him. But it's just about a small portion of his 23-year-long military career. He flew during World War II. He was a pilot. Colonel Prouty was a very interesting individual. And if you've ever seen the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, his character was, there was a character called Mr. X. That character was based on Prouty. So let me read you a little bit about who he is. Colonel Prouty spent 9 of his 23-year military career in the Pentagon from 1955 to 1964. 2 years with the Secretary of Defense, 2 years with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and 5 years with Headquarters, U.S. Air Force. In 1955, he was appointed the first, stuff that's up on the site, but I believe he still does. I think he might still do a live show once in a while, if not more often. Check it out, Black Op Radio. So we got a few minutes before the break comes up, so I'm going to wait until we get back into the second segment to play the clip. But I urge you guys again to go to prouty.org, prouty.org, and get his book, The Secret Team. It's imperative that you read this book to understand and for you to be able to explain how the CIA can control things. Because when you say to somebody, well, the CIA controls things, and they say, yeah, how? Explain it to me. And you're like, well, they own this, and they say, but give me an example. This way you can smash all of that. You can explain. Once you understand, you can break it down to a more simplistic form. As they say, can you break it down in one sentence? In fact, somebody actually commented, this is a 4-part video series, and there's way more interviews. If you go to Len's site or email him at osanic@prouty.org, which is osanic@prouty.org. Email him, and you can ask him about his show times or whatever, but he's got another site, and I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but you can purchase, it might even be at prouty.org, you might be able to get it there, the interviews that he's done and all the interviews that Colonel Prouty's done with a couple other people. I mean, this is historical, evidence that needs to be purchased and archived away somewhere. Because this stuff, if it disappears, it's gone. They'll never even talk about this. This is stuff that they won't talk about. And he talked.
Either we heal as a team, or we're going to crumble. Inch by inch, play by play, till we're finished. We're in hell right now, gentlemen, believe me. And we can stay here, get the shit kicked out of us, or we can fight our way back into the light. We can climb out of hell. 1 inch at a time. When you get old in life, things get taken from you. I mean, that's part of life. But you only learn that when you start losing stuff. You find out life's this game of inches. So is football. Because in either game, life or football, the margin for error is so small. I mean, 1/2 a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us. They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second. On this team, we fight for that inch. On this team, we tear ourselves and everyone else around us to pieces for that inch. We claw our fingernails for that inch. Because we know when we add up all those inches, that's going to make the fucking difference between winning and willing to die who's going to win that inch. And I know if I'm going to have any life anymore, it's because I'm still willing to fight and die for that inch. Because that's what living is. There's 6 inches in front of your face. Now, I can't make you do it. You got to look at the guy next to you. Look into his eyes. Now, I think you're going to see a guy who will go that inch with you. You're going to see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're going to do the same for him. That's a team, gentlemen. And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
Ideas are bulletproof.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's show. It is January 18th, 2012. This is Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye, from federaljack.com. Thank you for tuning in tonight. It's going to be a special broadcast that I have prepared for you guys. And as always, I try to bring you guys something special. And recently, I came across a 4-part interview, and I believe it was with Len Osenek. And I'll tell you about Len, and I'll tell you about who the interview is with in a second. But it's about, I would say, a little less than 8 hours long, just one of the interviews. And there's multiple ones with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. And you've heard me talk about him in his book, The Secret Team, on the show here before. So tonight, for a few segments, I'm going to bring Colonel Prouty on to the show. Now, he's been dead since 2001, so I'm not going to be doing a seance.